Okay, so in this lecture, we've talked about two seemingly pretty deep meditative experiences. One I've called the exterior version of not-self. The other one is called emptiness or formlessness. And I've said that if you're among the many of us who have not attained enlightenment, you're kind of wondering, well, what would it be like, and trying to imagine it. I think these two experiences would be good candidates for kind of basic elements of the Enlightenment experience. And we've already talked earlier in the course about some other candidates for that. I would say that the interior version of not-self, that is looking within yourself, seeing thoughts, feelings, and so on, but no real self. I say that's a good candidate for basic ingredient of enlightenment. And so is the apprehension of impermanence, the kind of deep sense that, yes, impermanence and a kind of fluidity kind of pervade reality. So I'd say if you were doing like a presentation on enlightenment, and I guess in a way that's what I'm doing now, and you needed actual bullet points, elements of enlightenment, I would nominate these four. Now, obviously, different people have different views about what enlightenment is, but I think if we're going to try to kind of flesh it out, wrap our minds around it, these would be for me kind of the basic four dimensions based on talks I've had with people who have had much deeper meditative experiences than me, and also based on kind of my understanding of Buddhist doctrine. So with these four in place, these four elements of enlightenment in place, we can now proceed to try to answer the big question, is enlightenment enlightening? In other words, do these four kind of elemental experiences tend to get people closer to the truth about things? Now, it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to address this question from a Darwinian standpoint. Okay, that is to say, I'm gonna keep in mind the kinds of biases and perceptual distortions that natural selection seems to have endowed us with, and that's going to inform my conception of what a truthful apprehension of the world would be. Now, to pave the way for that analysis, I'd like to get back to a theme that I brought up at the very beginning of the course. I said that in some ways I thought that kind of the Buddhist meditative path was a rebellion against natural selection, against natural selection's agenda, against the values implicit in natural selection. So I would like to look at some of these elements of enlightenment from that standpoint and talk about the sense in which they are part of a rebellion against natural selection, and then I think that'll help us get clear on whether the rebellion is really on the side of truth. So let's start out with what I've called the exterior version of not-self. Now, as we've seen, that involves a kind of diminished sense of separation between you and the people and things in the world, right? In fact, there's such a sense of continuity that you begin to think that to harm others would be to harm yourself. In other words, you start to doubt that there's any real difference between kind of your interests and their interests. Well, from natural selection's point of view, this is absolute heresy. I mean, if there's one idea that natural selection has kind of built into us, it's that, this is my body, it stops right here, it has interests. They are not necessarily the same as the interests of other beings, and they are definitely more important than the interests of other beings, right? That just follows from the logic of natural selection. I mean, if indeed inside me are these genes that were selected because they're good at getting copies of themselves into the next generation, then job one for these genes is going to be taking care of this vehicle for the genes, this body. And that means they're very likely going to build into my brain the idea that taking care of this body is much more important than kind of any other bodies getting taken care of. In other words, my interests are paramount. I am, in some sense, special. Now, this bias is kind of built into all animal life, and you see it in all kinds of ways. You see it with animals eating each other, for example. In our species, you do see it sometimes with people killing each other, sometimes in somewhat subtler ways. You know, people vying to displace one another in status hierarchies and things like that. Sometimes you see it in very subtle ways, you know. So if you're trying to hail a cab, right, and you notice that someone next to you is also trying to hail a cab, well, you naturally reach your arm higher than their arm because you want to get the cab. And, you know, implied is the idea that, well, it's more important that you get the cab than that they get the cab, even though for all you know, this is like it's some physician who needs to get to the hospital and save somebody's life. So this exterior version of not self, this perception of a fundamental continuity of interest between you and all of life, really it involves transcending one of the most basic kind of precepts built into us by natural selection, which is just that we are special. Now, I think that the experience of emptiness or formlessness has this same property of kind of transcending or even defying, you might say, the basic idea that we are special. But I think the logic in this case is a little bit subtler, so let me kind of go over it. Now, emptiness, it is the experience that things don't have essence, right? They don't have this strong kind of affective value. You don't have strong feelings, distinctive feelings about these individual things. Well, let's back up and ask, what are feelings for in the first place? You may remember from an earlier lecture that seems to be the case that at the very beginning, you know, kind of the dawn of feelings in the living world, their mission, the mission of feelings, was to take care of the organism, specifically to get it to approach things that are good for it, to avoid things that are bad for it, right? So in other words, feelings are judgments about the environment from the perspective of that organism's interests. So if some very simple organism kind of feels kind of a bad vibe about something that is a toxin, then it shies away from it. That's good for the organism, but it's just not the case that that toxin is bad in a universal sense. It's not bad for all of life or anything. So that particular judgment is only from the point of view of that organism, and it implies the fundamental mission of taking care of just that organism. Now, that organism shying away from a toxin is not a matter of great moral consequence. And in fact, that's true of a lot of the kind of affective judgments that a lot of us make in the course of everyday life. So, for example, I have kind of a good feeling about split-level houses. There's like an essence of split-level house that gives me a good feeling. I assume that's because I actually lived in one when I was 6 years old. And then there are houses that I might look at, kinds of houses, and they might give me a bad vibe. Maybe I think they're ostentatious or whatever. In any event, it doesn't matter all that much that I have those feelings about houses and other people have other feelings. That's not a matter of great consequence. However, when we start making these affective judgments about other people, when we start kind of attributing essence to other people, then matters become more consequential. So, I think that my friends are good. I mean, they give me a good feeling. There's kind of essence of good person that they seem to kind of exude. Whereas I think that my rivals and enemies are bad. And when you think about it, it feels like real. It feels like that's a, there's objective truth to that. But it really can't be the case that there is, right? Because after all, my friends have rivals, and those rivals look at my friends and they get this negative essence when they look at them, right? And my enemies have friends, and those friends look at my enemies and they get this kind of positive vibe, right? So obviously somebody is wrong here, right? We can't all be right. There's a contradiction somewhere. And the contradiction is really just built into the system by natural selection. I mean, if this planet is full of people whose kind of perceptual machinery was designed based on the premise that each of them is more important than all of the rest of them, well then obviously contradictions will arise, right? Because that is itself an internally contradictory premise. It can't be the case that they're all more important than everyone else. Now I would say this tendency toward essentialism, toward attributing essence to things, becomes even more consequential when you move away from judgments about individual people and start talking about judgments about groups of people. Okay, so for example, racism is a form of essentialism. It's like looking at an ethnic group and attributing just some sort of bad quality to the whole group and having that feeling about the group. Nationalism is a form of essentialism. It's the idea that, hey, my nation, my national group of people has this like good thing in them. Other nations, other national groups, not so much. And when there's tension between two national groups, then the other national group is going to have, actively bad kind of essence, right? And the deeper the conflict gets, the more pronounced that judgment's going to be. The better your national group is, the worse the other national group is, right? And the same is true of groups in general, right? Whether it's, it can be racial groups, national groups, religions, ideological groups, whatever. As tension develops and a conflict gets deeper and deeper, they seem worse, your group seems better. This us versus them machinery is very powerful, and it kind of governs our attribution of essence to groups, sometimes in a very destructive way. I wouldn't say that we are by nature racist or anything like that, or even by nature nationalist or whatever. I would just say we are by nature groupist. Okay, we have this us versus them machinery, and it's been studied a lot actually by psychologists. And one of the best known studies, and in fact one of the best known psychological studies period of the 20th century possibly, was initiated by a football game that took place a few hundred yards from where I'm standing. It was in Palmer Stadium at Princeton University. Palmer Stadium is no longer standing because all things are impermanent. But this was in 1951. It was a game between Princeton and Dartmouth, and it was just kind of a famously rough game. Princeton had a nationally famous player, an All-American named Dick Kazmaier, and he left the game with a broken nose and a concussion. Dartmouth had a player who left the game with a broken leg. There were lots of penalties. There was much discussion afterwards about who had been more culpable, which team, and it became kind of a controversy. And two psychologists, one at Princeton and one at Dartmouth, decided to do a study. So they got students who had actually seen the game, and then they also got some students and showed them films of the game. And with all of these students on the Princeton and the Dartmouth side, they asked them to go through and fill out this survey about which team had been more responsible for starting the stuff, for sustaining it, whatever. Now they found that Princeton students tended to think Dartmouth was more responsible for the problems, and Dartmouth students had a different view. That, of course, does not surprise you at all. You could have predicted it. That's how universal this bias is. We just take it for granted. But what's interesting to me about the study is the way these two psychologists framed their findings, okay? Because they emphasized that, in their view, the actual perception of the world, the mere perception of the world, involves inherently imposing meaning on the perceptions. Here's what they wrote. It seems clear that the game actually was many different games, and that each version of the events that transpired was just as real to a particular person as other versions were to other people. An occurrence on the football field or in any other social situation does not become an experiential event unless and until some significance is given to it. An occurrence becomes an event only when the happening has significance. And a happening generally has significance only if it reactivates learned significances already registered in what we have called a person's assumptive form world. Okay, so the very act of perception seems to involve imposing meaning on things, imposing form on them. And we've already seen earlier in the course one of the mechanisms by which we impose meaning in situations very much like this football game. What we've seen is that when our allies do good things, we attribute that to their natures, their essential natures, and when they do bad things, we have some other explanation for it, about why it doesn't really reflect on them. With our enemies, it's the opposite. They do bad things, we attribute that to their essential nature. When they do good things, that's not so reflective of them. So there's this mechanism built into us by which we maintain our beliefs about the essences of our enemies and our friends, regardless of what they actually do. So it kind of makes you wonder about the reliability of our judgments in these matters, right? And the authors of this study were so aware of how much of the meaning in the world we impose on it in the course of perceiving it, that they raised the question of whether in the absence of this process, the football game itself even really exists. In brief, the data here indicate that there is no such thing as a game existing out there in its own right, which people merely observe. The game exists for a person and is experienced by him only insofar as certain happenings have significances in terms of his purpose. Out of all the occurrences going on in the environment, a person selects those that have some significance for him from his own egocentric position in the total matrix. So it's almost as if they're saying that the real world out there is formless until we impose form on it, until we impose meaning on it. And as we've seen, I think the imposing of that meaning involves attributing essences to things, which in turn depends on our assigning kind of affective value to those things. Now, they're not saying, the authors of this study aren't saying that you can't, if you're viewing things in a perfectly objective way, you can't like distinguish between different people on the field, or even the colors of the different jerseys that the two teams are wearing. But I think they are saying that if you're truly objective, then the whole framework of meaning that you use to see the world would kind of fall apart. Now, what would that be like? What would it be like if you attained enlightenment and went to this football game? That would be an interesting experience, right? Let's look at two of the elements of enlightenment, two of these things that we think are elements of enlightenment, and how they would affect your perception of the game. Well, first of all, the idea of formlessness, the experience of formlessness or emptiness, that would mean that, you just didn't sharply distinguish between the two teams. Certainly not in any significant way. You wouldn't, see, even if you were a student at Princeton or Dartmouth, if you had the feeling of formlessness, emptiness, you wouldn't see essence of good or essence of bad in either team. It would just be 22 people out there doing what they were doing. Similarly, what we've called the exterior version of not self would pretty profoundly influence your perception. You would see a continuity between you and the people on the field, right? So you would see basically suddenly two kinds of continuity between you and everyone else, and kind of among all the players, right? That's, I guess, what it would be like to go to a football game having attained enlightenment. So probably, if everyone attained enlightenment, it would be bad for attendance at football games, because I don't know why you'd bother going. Doesn't sound like a very interesting experience. On the other hand, if everyone attained enlightenment, there would also be lower attendance at wars and genocides and things like that. So maybe there is something to be said for that. So this perspective, the enlightened perspective, does seem to be a more benign point of view in the sense that it leads to fewer wars and things, in theory at least. It's a separate question, I guess, whether it's kind of literally a truer perspective, a more objectively true perspective. If you're sitting at that football game and you kind of don't see any difference between the teams, is that kind of true in some sense, objectively true? I think you could make that case. I mean, for one thing, that would mean you had kind of removed yourself from the bias through which the game is viewed by either an ardent Princeton fan or an ardent Dartmouth fan, right? And you, in that sense, would have maybe a more objective view of things. Interestingly, you would also have removed yourself from the perspective of our species, in a sense, right? Because it's in the nature of our species to choose sides. You know, we see a conflict develop between people, and we immediately try to figure out, well, who's on the side of right? Who's the good person? Who's the bad person? Which is another way of saying, who should we side with? And that seems to be because during human evolution, when there was a conflict within our society, it really mattered that we kind of figured out which side it was in our interest to be on. But for whatever reason, that seems to be part of the nature of our species. So, in other words, you know, to be a student at Dartmouth or Princeton means to choose Dartmouth or Princeton to favor, and to be a human being means to choose one side or the other to favor. It's just kind of built into our species. So the question arises, if you remove yourself from the very perspective of our species, you know, have you gotten closer to the truth? Is that in some sense more objective? You know, I think you could make that case. I mean, why should the perspective of any one species be kind of privileged as the objective truth? I mean, after all, species have different views of things, right? So to humans, you know, a stagnant swamp is just not a nice place. It's just kind of got a negative essence. To a mosquito, presumably, it's a very attractive place, right? It has a very positive essence. And I mean, who's to say who's right? I mean, obviously, it's true that for human beings, a stagnant swamp is a place you might want to avoid because you could get a disease. You could get bitten by a mosquito that carries a disease, in fact. So I'm not denying that. But it's the sense that you know, our judgment, our perception of essence is objectively true, right? That's what I'm questioning. And yet people act all the time as if the essences they perceive are true. People actually have arguments about which wine is better, right? Now, there was a Buddhist philosopher in the 7th century, Chandrakirti, and one thing he said is that what to a human being is water might be perceived by a certain kind of deity as nectar, and might be perceived by a hungry ghost as pus or blood, and it might taste accordingly to those three kinds of beings. And the basic idea there is just that, you know, the meaning of something, the very identity of something, the essence of something, depends on the particular perspective of the kind of being it is. And I guess it's in that spirit that I would say that if these elements of Buddhist enlightenment remove you from the perspective of your species, yes, they may be moving you closer to the objective truth. And so too, if they're removing you from the perspective of your own individual history, as they tend to do as well. Now, in some cases, these experiences might remove you from the perspective of species in general. We've seen that how a couple of these elements of enlightenment, in particular the idea of formlessness or emptiness, and the exterior version of not self, how they can undermine the very idea that you are special. And that is a bias that natural selection builds into all species, right? That this particular organism is the most important one in the world. There's actually an asterisk there. The exception is that to the extent that other organisms share your distinctive genes, then yes, you may think they're very special. You know, you may think your offspring are very special. That's because they're carrying your genes. But by and large, the idea that you are uniquely special is just a premise of natural selection. And so in that sense, enlightenment could, in theory, enlightenment as we conceive it, could extract your perspective from the very realm of evolved life. Now, I think we're ready to return to that kind of enlightenment checklist those four bullet points, the kind of ingredients of enlightenment. So now let's add 2 columns to that checklist: the truth about the world, the kind of objective truth about the world, and moral truth. And let's go through and look at these 4 proposed elements of enlightenment and see whether it seems plausible to say that they are conducive to truth in each of these sentences. Now, I know that moral truth in particular is kind of a famously hard thing to define. And in particular, when in the realm of Buddhism, there are sometimes questions raised, wait a second, doesn't ultimate enlightenment involve transcending even the kind of good-bad duality? And it all gets very complicated. That's a very good and important question, but it's also like a whole nother course to grapple with it satisfactorily. So I'm just going to kind of glide over that and say that, my rough and ready definition of moral truth is like, first of all, free of obviously distorting biases on moral judgment, and also, if it's a state of mind that's kind of less conducive to killing people and starting wars and stuff, I would call that closer to moral truth. Okay, that's kind of my rough and ready conception. So let's start at the top. The exterior version of not self. Yeah, I would say that moves you closer to moral truth. Even aside from the fact that it leaves you spending less time, killing and tormenting other beings, it involves removing the manifestly untenable assumption that you are more special than any other organism on the planet. We've seen how it does undermine that bias. I'd say much the same thing about the experience of formlessness or emptiness. We've seen how that too involves removing yourself from that assumption of your own specialness. And as a practical matter, it involves not attributing, essence of bad to people who happen to be on the wrong team and then justifying, hurting or killing them. Now, you might be able to argue that these 2 elements of enlightenment are also conducive to apprehending just kind of the truth about the world, the objective truth about the physical world, but that's a subtle matter that, I don't think I'll get into. I don't think I'll make that claim right now. Now, the interior version of not self is interesting because I think it actually gets a check mark in both columns. We've seen earlier in the course that it does bring you like a perception of your mind that seems to accord with some findings of modern psychology, brings you arguably a truer perception of just the actual reality of your mind. But I also think it can bring you closer to moral truth because it can give you this kind of critical distance from some of these feelings that embody kind of self-serving judgments about the world, self-serving attributions of essence about the world, Finally, impermanence, I don't think there is such a strong case that it has moral implications. You might be able to make the argument that it does. But yeah, it's safe to say that yes, ultimately everything is impermanent. Ultimately, you look at a lot of things that we think of as things, and they turn out to be processes and more in flux than we at first think. So yeah, I think we can give that a check mark in the truth about the world column. So looking at the results of this analysis, I think I would say that in the end, there is a correspondence between Buddhist enlightenment, as we're kind of imagining, not having attained it, and what I would call Darwinian enlightenment, which raises the question, what is Darwinian enlightenment? Well, here's what I mean. If you look at the influence of evolution on our way of thinking, on our way of feeling, and if you look at the kind of vestiges of the evolutionary process that assume the form of kind of biases and kind of distortions in our perception and our thought, and you ask, well, what would life be like? What would experience be like if you removed all these biases? I think it would look something like what we are imagining Buddhist enlightenment to look like. And in a way, that's one of the main points of this course. Now, that may sound like a moot point, right? Because, again, most of us are not very close to Buddhist enlightenment. Most of us can't realistically hope to get there. But at the same time, you know, as I've said, if you're moving along the meditative path, you know, in the general direction of this thing that is said to lie at the culmination of the path called enlightenment, well then presumably, if enlightenment is ultimate truth, even if it's a totally theoretical thing and no one's ever gotten there, if it in theory is ultimate truth, then presumably movement along this path is incremental progress in the direction of truth, okay? Now, this would be actually a pretty logical place to stop the course because this is a lot of what I've been trying to convey. But there is one question we've left dangling. At the beginning of the course, I said I was interested in the question of whether what I call the naturalistic version of Buddhism, you know, the version without reincarnation, deities, and so on, could qualify as a spiritual worldview or even a religion. So in the next segment, we're going to spend a few minutes on that, and then we'll be done.